So I thought I'd do a few short slides just to go through this diagram, where it comes from, what it means, and then also interpreting the graphs that come up in the slideshow. So this diagram on the left shows the female reproductive organs, the vagina, uterus, oviducts, sometimes called the egg tubes or the fallopian tubes, and the ovaries in that yellow colour. On the right hand side shows a magnified view of an ovary, and this is showing what's going on inside. So I'm going to go through what these different parts represent. All of these circles or spheres in the blue represent developing follicles at different stages of the menstrual cycle. So towards the left, the smaller ones, these are the younger ones, and then over towards the right, as they get bigger, these represent the older or larger, more mature follicles. Then you get to this image. This is where the follicle has ruptured on the surface of the ovary or burst, and this is perfectly normal, and this is how the egg or the ovum is then released, which then starts to travel down the oviduct. And it's from this point, halfway through the cycle, where the egg has a chance of being fertilized. If the egg is fertilized, the remaining leftover follicle, which just burst to release the egg, stays, and it is now called the corpus luteum, or yellow body, basically because it looks like a yellow blob. While it is in existence, it produces progesterone, and this helps to maintain the uterus lining until the developing embryo itself starts to take control and maintain the lining itself. Now coming on to these graphs. These graphs are a mixture of the usual lines that you'd see on a typical graph, plus also images and diagrams to try and show what is going on at different stages of the menstrual cycle. So I've just put on here the key points you need to think about. So firstly, identify a point on the x-axis. This is the time, and there'll usually be some sort of indication of some of the points. So on here we've got day 1, 4, 14 and 28. You need to view all of the pieces of information together at the same time and try and understand what the cause and the effect is. So what is it that is causing the effect, and what is the actual effect? So I'm going to go through and give an example to this. So on this graph, we've got a line which represents the relative amounts of estrogen. There isn't a scale on the y-axis, so this is literally just a way of showing when estrogen is lower and when it is higher. You can see the peak there coming up just before day 14. The orangey line represents progesterone, so similar to estrogen, this is showing where the peaks and the levels and the troughs are. And you can see that progesterone is produced in much higher quantities after the egg has been released if it is fertilized, and this maintains the uterus lining. At the bottom of this diagram, you have got a diagrammatic representation of how thick the uterus lining is. So you should hopefully be able to see that on day 4 it is at its thinnest, and then from day 14 to day 28 it is at its thickest. Don't worry too much about the squiggles and the lumps and the bumps. This is just showing the lining and its structure, or giving an indication of that. You don't have to read all of the individual ups and downs when you're doing any interpretation of this. So what I tend to do when there's a graph with several pieces of information is put a ruler at a point, represented here by a grey line. So if we have a look at day 4, we can see all of the information together. So estrogen and progesterone are at relatively low levels. There is more estrogen than progesterone, and both of these hormones are increasing quite slowly, but they are increasing. So day 4, the uterus lining is at its lowest, and it will soon start to build up. If we move this line now towards the right, so the quantity of estrogen in the blood is increasing. Progesterone is still increasing at a similar sort of rate as it was before, and the lining of the uterus is starting to build up, and the build-up of the uterus lining is due to the increasing levels of estrogen. So that is very simply how you might interpret this graph, and you could put that ruler line at any point and think about what is happening. It's also quite useful, like I did on my animation, to move the ruler from one point to the next so you can see the changes that are taking place during that time. Sometimes you can get even more information. None of these have been included on this presentation, but this is an example of something you might see in a more complicated version in a textbook, for example, or on the internet. So this gives, similar to the last one, at the bottom a representation of the thickness of the lining. This time it's just by a plain pink section. Above that, you have got the main hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And you can see the patterns don't look exactly the same. Depending on which publication you're looking at, there may be more or less detail, the lines might be slightly more jagged, but the peaks and troughs will be in a similar position. You'll also notice here that estrogen is written down with an alternative spelling. Both this spelling and the one with OESTROGEN are acceptable. In addition, on this diagram, above estrogen and progesterone, you have got lines which represent the relative levels of the hormones that are produced by the pituitary as well. And you could do a similar thing with the ruler line to find out how these levels are changing over the course of the menstrual cycle. And if you have a look at the section on the left-hand side, you see that the FSH is increasing, and then this then leads to the increase in estrogen that you see. It's slightly delayed in the ovarian hormone section. This diagram also has right at the top, the final part, an image of what the developing follicle looks like, and then the corpus luteum, and showing what is happening. So ovulation, you can see that the developing follicle, there's a gap in the follicle. This is where the ovum is going to be released. So these graphs, these diagrams can get pretty complicated, but it's just about keeping your wits about you, looking at what's happening at one stage of the x-axis and looking and comparing the relative levels of what the different hormones are doing, whether they are increasing, whether they're about to decrease, and thinking about which of these hormones causes the effect, and then thinking about what the effect is based on the information from the other presentation. So I hope this has made this a little bit clearer, and any questions, please just let me know.